Back away! Back away! Back away now! Back away! Back back!
Europe tells Britain, your protest laws have gone too far. If you're tired of surface-level political coverage that treats you like you can't handle complexity, hit subscribe right now. UK Connors doesn't do simplified nonsense. We do intelligent analysis of people who actually care about what's happening to our country. Now, let's talk about what happens when Europe's human rights watchdog decide British authorities have rather overstepped the mark. The Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner, Michael O'Flaherty, has sent a letter to Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood that essentially amounts to a diplomatic slap across the face. The message? Britain's protest laws have gone too far. Our policing of demonstrations raises serious human rights concerns. And frankly, Westminster needs to have a long, hard look at what it's doing. The timing is exquisite. The implications are enormous. And the government's response tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they're taking criticism from European institutions these days. O'Flaherty's concerns center on two pieces of legislation passed under the previous Conservative government. The Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act from 2022 and the Public Order Act from 2023. Both were designed, ostensibly, to give police greater powers to manage protests that were causing significant disruption. Remember Just Stop Oil gluing themselves to motorways? Extinction Rebellion blocking roads? Those laws were Parliament's answer to environmental activists who decided that causing maximum inconvenience was their most effective weapon. But here's where it gets interesting. O'Flaherty argues these laws allow authorities to impose excessive limits on freedom of assembly and expression and risk over-policing. Excessive limits. Over-policing. These aren't throwaway phrases from some minor bureaucrat. This is Europe's Human Rights Commissioner formally stating that British law has crossed a line, that the balance between public order and fundamental freedoms has tilted too far towards state control. The Commissioner has called for a comprehensive review of whether current protest legislation complies with the UK's human rights obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. That's a convention Britain signed up to back in 1950, the one that's supposed to guarantee fundamental freedoms, and increasingly, the one that certain politicians would quite like to tear up and throw in the Thames. The Conservative Party has already announced it would leave the convention entirely if it wins the next general election. Let that settle for a moment. A major British political party is promising to withdraw from the foundational European human rights framework. The Labour government, meanwhile, is reviewing how the convention applies to UK law regarding asylum cases, which is diplomatic speak for we'd like more wiggle room to do what we want without European courts interfering. Shabana Mahmood's response to O'Flaherty's letter is telling. She defended the right to protest as a fundamental freedom, but insisted it must be balanced with the right of people to live without fear. Government sources went further, suggesting Mahmood takes a dim view of the arguments and fundamentally disagrees with the assessment. There's also this delicious line. It doesn't help sustain public confidence in the European Convention when the Council is seen to intervene in domestic politics and national security. Translation, stop interfering in our business. The tension here is palpable. Europe's human rights body is warning Britain about overreach. Britain is essentially responding with thanks, but no thanks. We'll police our streets as we see fit. It's a collision between international human rights standards and domestic political priorities. And frankly, the domestic priorities seem to be winning. O'Flaherty's letter followed a 5-day visit to the UK over the summer, during which he presumably observed enough to raise alarm bells. His concerns extend beyond existing legislation to Labour's current crime and policing bill, which is being debated in Parliament right now. The bill includes measures that would ban protesters from wearing face coverings in particular locations. O'Flaherty argues such bans shouldn't be enforced unless there's evidence of imminent violence. The government's position appears to be that preventing potential disorder justifies restricting how people can dress while protesting. The bill would also restrict gatherings in the vicinity of places of worship. The government says this responds to intimidating protests near synagogues and mosques. Fair enough on the surface, but O'Flaherty points out that vicinity is undefined. What does vicinity mean? 100 meters? 500? A mile? Without definition, the term becomes whatever authorities want it to mean, and suddenly organizing protests in large cities or towns becomes practically impossible. It's the sort of vague language that gives enforcement bodies enormous discretion, which is precisely what worries civil liberties advocates. Recent government announcements have pushed things further. Police officers can now instruct protest organizers to hold events in different locations if a site has seen repeated demonstrations. Ministers have also suggested they might target specific chant use at pro-Palestinian protests. We're watching the boundaries of acceptable protests being redrawn in real time, and the justification is always the same: public safety, community cohesion, preventing intimidation. The Palestine Action Ban has become a flashpoint. The government designated the group as a terrorist organization, and hundreds of people have been arrested at protests against that decision. People holding placards saying "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action" have found themselves in police custody. O'Flaherty noted a large number of arrests and warned that domestic laws designed to counter terrorism or violent extremism must not impose limitations on fundamental rights that aren't strictly necessary for protecting national security. Defend Our Juries, campaigning against the Palestine Action Ban, has accused ministers of pursuing an anti-democratic agenda. The government position is that Palestine Action's tactics, which have included direct action against defense companies, cross the line from protest into something more dangerous. Where you stand on this rather depends on whether you think the state should have expansive powers to define what constitutes terrorism or whether that definitional power itself poses risks to democratic freedoms. Mahmoud defended the government's approach by highlighting the fear within religious communities, particularly the Jewish community. Large, repeated protests can leave sections of our country feeling unsafe, intimidated, and scared to leave their homes, she stated. This has been particularly evident in relation to considerable fear within the Jewish community. It's a powerful argument emotionally, and it touches on genuine concerns about antisemitism and community safety. But it also raises thorny questions about where the line sits between protecting communities and restricting political expression. Conservative Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philps seized on O'Flaherty's letter to make his party's case for leaving the European Convention on Human Rights entirely. This is the latest example of foreign bureaucrats lecturing Britain on how to police its own streets, he declared, adding that this is precisely why conservatives are committed to leaving the ECHR. Foreign bureaucrats. It's designed to trigger a particular response, to frame human rights oversight as unwanted interference from outsiders who don't understand British circumstances. But here's the thing about international human rights frameworks. They exist precisely to provide external oversight, to ensure that domestic political pressures don't erode fundamental freedoms. When governments start viewing that oversight as interference rather than accountability, when they frame compliance with human rights obligations as optional rather than essential, we're entering different territory. O'Flaherty hasn't limited his concerns to protest laws. He's also written separately about transgender rights, warning against creating legal uncertainty as the government implements a Supreme Court judgment from earlier this year. The court ruled unanimously that woman is defined by biological sex under the 2010 Equality Act. Britain's equalities watchdog subsequently issued guidance stating that in places like hospitals, shops, and restaurants, trans women, described as biological men, should not be permitted to use women's facilities. The guidance awaits government approval, and O'Flaherty argues it risks leaving trans people in an unacceptable intermediate zone, where their legal gender recognition becomes practically meaningless. He's urged the government to be clear about how inclusion of trans people can be achieved and how exclusion can be minimized in situations where it's strictly necessary and proportionate. Downing Street responded that laws protect trans people from discrimination and harassment, that Britain upholds a robust legislative framework, but we have never supported self-identification. It's careful language, threading a needle between competing demand from different groups with very different views on how trans rights should be balanced against other considerations. What we're watching across both these issues, protest laws and trans rights, is the same fundamental tension. International human rights bodies are warning Britain about potential overreach, about measures that might look reasonable domestically but raise concerns when measured against international standards. The British government's response is essentially defensive, insisting it knows best, that its approach balances competing rights appropriately, that external criticism doesn't fully grasp the complexities of British circumstances. There's a pattern emerging. The previous government passed laws that expanded police powers over protests. The current government is continuing that trajectory with new legislation. When Europe's Human Rights Commissioner raises concerns, the response is dismissive. When he warns about trans rights, allies of the Home Secretary suggest the Supreme Court is beyond reproach, which is a neat way of saying the issue is settled domestically regardless of what European institutions think. The Conservative commitment to leave the European Convention on Human Rights entirely isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a broader narrative about British sovereignty, about taking back control, about not being answerable to foreign courts or commissioners. Labour's position is more nuanced, but heading in a similar direction. They are not proposing to leave a convention, but they're reviewing how it applies, looking for space to maneuver, particularly on asylum. The implications are significant. If Britain's relationship with European human rights institutions continues deteriorating, if domestic legislation keeps expanding state powers while international oversight is increasingly dismissed as interference, we're fundamentally changing the framework that's existed since the Second World War. The European Convention on Human Rights was created in the aftermath of totalitarianism, designed to prevent the state from trampling individual freedoms. Viewing it as an obstacle rather than a safeguard represents a philosophical shift. O'Flaherty's letters, both on protest laws and trans rights, are diplomatic warnings. They are saying Britain is moving in directions that concern those tasked with monitoring human rights compliance. The government's response suggests those concerns aren't particularly welcome. Government sources briefing that Mahmoud takes a dim view of the arguments reveals an administration that feels it's being lectured rather than engaged in constructive dialogue. What's fascinating is how both major parties have landed in roughly the same place on this. Conservatives want out of the convention entirely. Labour want to stay in, but with modifications to how it constrains British policy. Neither party seems particularly interested in what Europe's Human Rights Commissioner thinks about British laws. The political incentives all point toward demonstrating strength, not appearing weak by accepting external criticism, showing voters that politicians are tough on protesters or immigration or whatever the issue of the day happens to be. But there's a cost to all this. International human rights frameworks depend on good faith participation, on countries accepting that external oversight serves a purpose, on viewing criticism as an opportunity for reflection rather than an attack on sovereignty. When that breaks down, when compliance becomes optional, when domestic politics consistently trump international obligations, the entire system